Hey, what's up, everybody? Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of our very own fee-only certified financial planners. Please note this podcast is intended for educational purposes and should not be considered financial or investment advice, as we do not know all the variables to one's personal situation when answering a question. Before we jump into today's question, a shout out to our extraordinary YFP financial planning team that makes this segment possible. Your Financial Pharmacist offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. So whether you want to pay off your student loans, make the right investment decisions, or simply build a solid financial plan, we'll help get your income working for you rather than the other way around. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from the YFP Facebook group, where someone asks, I will be starting residency in June. Do I need professional liability insurance as a resident? YFP has taught me well, thank you for the shout out, and emphasized the importance of liability insurance as a pharmacist. I simply want to confirm that this applies to residents as well. I won't have a lot of money to spare and do not want to purchase something unnecessary. However, I want to be sure I am appropriately protected. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts here?
My answer to this would be, typically, and again, it's going to be dependent on the situation. There's going to be some people that might be going through a resident that maybe it doesn't apply. But I think if you're practicing it, or if you're in that type of environment, it'd probably be advisable to start building this into your budget. The purpose of liability coverage is really to protect you if you are, say, individually named in a lawsuit. If your employer doesn't have the proper coverage in place to protect you, or typically, which could be very common for a resident, maybe if you're picking up extra shifts or doing things like that, volunteering, giving advice to friends and family, that might be an incident where you definitely want to have coverage. So I think the idea here is you definitely want to protect yourself, but I think it's also assessing like, what is the risk that you are potentially, exposing yourself to? So, the numbers that you typically say is that the average cost for a pharmacist to defend a lawsuit is, typically north of $14,000. And then there's typically the average out there is like 91,000 if the claim is settled against you. So we're talking about a premium that might be $100, $120, $130 a year to have that peace of mind where you're going to have the professional liability coverage that is going to, cover you for up to $1 million for each claim, license protection, personal liability coverage, a defense attorney, assault coverage. All of those things are typically baked into these types of policy. So, I would say, depending on, what your residency looks like, I would say yes. If you are around patients, if you could potentially be named in a lawsuit, I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's not a cookie cutter thing, all the time. So I don't know, Tim. I would actually volley this one back to you. What's your thoughts on this as you reflect back on your residency? And is this something that you think that is something to kind of get early and build into the plan?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, Tim, I was having flashbacks to my residency in 2009. And, I joke, but I don't joke. Like, fresh out of pharmacy school, you're a registered pharmacist, you're beginning to make independent decisions. I worked in a primary care practice, essentially getting to the point of prescribing, alongside of the physician, making recommendations. And I feel like that residency training period, perhaps more than any time, you're just getting started. Obviously, you're applying a lot of the knowledge that you learned. Like, I think it's a perfect time to be thinking about the protection that you have in place, especially relative to the cost of the policies. And we talked about that, in detail. Tim, you and I did an episode where we talked about episode 155, why you need professional liability insurance. And I would point people there for more information, but not to say the cost is insignificant. I think any cost during residency certainly is noteworthy. But, what you think of in terms of the coverage and having your best interest in mind, as well as a peace of mind that can come from these policies, especially while you're in the training year, right? You've got other things you're thinking about, other priorities, other goals. You've got other stressors going on throughout the year. I think it's certainly worthwhile. Tim, my follow-up to you is, I think folks may say, Tim, my employer offers a policy. Like, isn't that enough? What are some things folks need to think about in terms of the employer policy and whether that really should be a plan versus them having their own individual policy?
Yeah, I'm definitely a big proponent of having their individual policy. Again, the employer policy is typically there to protect the employer, not necessarily you as a practitioner under the employees or under the employer. So I would always default that the plan is nice, and sometimes it could go as such that you are covered by the employer. But if there is some type of negligence, whether it was intentional or not, the employer has a decision to make to say, okay, like, we're gonna protect this person or potentially leave them out to dry. So I think it's always good to understand kind of the angles, and if you have a policy that you are named as the primary insured, then that's a big piece of protection that you want to have built into the financial plan. So, I often say with a lot of these insurance benefits that you receive from the employer, it is a benefit, it's not a plan. Typically, we're typically things like life and disability insurance. Those are perks to you as an employee of that, but you typically want to have your own insurance plan, your own insurance policies. And I would say the same is true for the liability coverage, and make sure that you are protected in a way that it leaves little gaps for
Mm-hmm.
exposure for someone to come after you and name you individually in a policy. So that would be my, especially, again, it goes back to sometimes we have a long conversation about is this worth the money. Maybe it's not a now, it's a not now, but I
Mm-hmm.
think because the dollars are typically minimal. And again, I know dollars can be tight in a residency year or years, but I think building that in sooner rather than later is going to be advisable.
Yeah, I've heard you say before, it's employer policy is more of a perk, not a plan,
Yep.
right? And I think that's a good reminder. You said not it's a benefit more than a plan. And to your point, it's an opportunity here to take a step back and look at other employer perks or other employer benefits. You mentioned life, you mentioned disability. What is afforded you coverage wise? What are the gaps? And how can you work to fill those gaps, whether it's life, whether it's disability, or here we're talking about professional liability insurance, such an important part of the financial plan, and I think often overlooked because it's not so fun to talk about, right? When we think about,
Right.
professional liability, life, or disability. Appreciate the question and the engagement from the YFP Facebook group. If you're not already a part of that community, I hope you'll join now more than 7,000 pharmacists all across the country that are really encouraging one another, asking questions, challenging one another on their path towards achieving financial freedom. And if you have a question that you'd like to have featured on this show, please go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP, or you can also send us your question via email at info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Have a great rest of your week.